Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for asking me to present this talk today on the special anniversary of the St. John of God Research Study Day. The fundamental question that I want to answer today is what has been the value of the Psychosis research program? And the value or the usefulness of any research program is a question that I guarantee you every researcher asks themselves from time to time, particularly when things aren't running smoothly, as is so often the case. But we, and by we, I mean the participants, the funders and the researchers, we persist with research because the ultimate aim of healthcare research is to drive better outcomes for our patients and conduct research that is underpinned by the values of the St. John of God Order. So where do we start? Well, one of the fundamental building blocks of research lies in data collection. But it's important to think carefully about the type of data that we collect, and most importantly, how we are going to use it or apply the knowledge or insights. The Psychosis research program has been running for over 30 years and is focused on a wide variety of areas, starting in the 1980s and into the 1990s, with research that focused on the etiology of psychosis. This was led by one of the great pioneers of both Irish and worldwide psychosis research, the late Professor Éabhaird O'Callaghan. At that time, the neurodevelopmental model of schizophrenia was very influential. This neurodevelopmental hypothesis of schizophrenia focused on aberrant genes and early neural hazards. Studies confirmed that low birth weight, hypoxia, and other obstetric complications were linked to increased risk of schizophrenia, as were prenatal exposure to viral infections and nutritional deficiencies. But the finding of considerable variation in the incidence of schizophrenia across populations had important etiological implications and was used to argue for more environmental and contextual influences on schizophrenia risk. Social class, urban birth and upbringing, and indeed the degree of urbanicity were found to be associated with later risk of schizophrenia. This was a time of great change in how we conceptualized many illnesses, and schizophrenia was no different. So the neurodevelopmental hypothesis grew into the developmental risk factor model of psychosis and incorporated childhood and adult adversity, urban living and migration, as well as heavy cannabis use as important risk factors, with dysregulated striatal dopamine the final common pathway. The developmental model took into account evidence that indicates that schizophrenia is not a discrete disease entity, but rather the severe end of a broader multidimensional psychosis spectrum. At this time, the prevailing theories thought of diagnosis strictly in categories, particularly schizophrenia. Studies focused on examining people with the same diagnosis who were at quite different points of illness. However, many research groups broadened their focus to include all cases of psychosis, and attention turned to examining the outcomes of psychosis. Outcomes of psychotic disorders were noted to be associated with high personal, societal, and clinical burden, and thus an urgent need to improve these outcomes was identified. And one of the best ways to do this was by longitudinal studies. These are a type of research study that primarily uses the method of data collection by observation of individuals over a period of time. They can help researchers learn more about cause and effect relationships and are also highly flexible, which means that the focus they use can be shifted over time. And of course, one of the most famous longitudinal studies in general medicine began in 1967, the Whitehall study, which examined cardiovascular health amongst British civil servants. So could something similar be done for psychosis in Ireland? So in 1995, the Dublin first episode psychosis study started. It was based in the Cluain Mhuire catchment area and recruited people who presented with a first episode of psychosis over a 4-year period. It was twinned with a rural arm in Cavan Monaghan. The study looked at a wide variety of areas, including causes, childhood development, health service utilisation. Outcome was assessed in a multidimensional manner that took account of symptom burden, functioning and quality of life. And the study was truly longitudinal, as there were follow-up points at 6 months, 4 years, 8 years, 12 years, and 20 years. One of the areas that we spent a lot of time examining was the duration of untreated psychosis. This is the length of time that people spend actively psychotic but untreated before their illness is detected. The data indicated that there were long delays between developing psychotic symptoms and receiving treatment. These treatment delays were associated with increased suicidality and poor quality of life at presentation. Treatment delays had far-reaching consequences and were associated with poorer outcomes at 6 months, 4 years, 8 years, 12 years, and also at 20 years, and Donal will discuss this in more detail in a later presentation. But returning to the point that I raised earlier, could the evidence from these studies be translated into clinical practice? So, undeterred by the statistic from healthcare research that it takes 17 years to apply less than 10% of knowledge to benefit patients, and with seed funding from the St. John of God Order, Ireland's first early intervention in psychosis service was developed in Dublin in 2005. A similar service was also developed in Cavan Monaghan, and this paralleled the development of many worldwide early intervention in psychosis services. Sitting behind the clinical service is a comprehensive research program that is clinically focused and has looked at areas as diverse as negative symptoms at presentation, depression and quality of life, aggression and violence at presentation, a health economic evaluation, and employment status amongst those with psychosis, and Niall will discuss this in more detail in the following presentation. We have also examined the very clinically relevant area of engagement with treatment. One of the areas where we've been doing a lot of work on recently is the physical health of those with psychosis. This work has been driven by data from the first episode psychosis study. When we looked at the 12-year follow-up data, 10% of the sample, or 17 individuals, had sadly died. This is consistent with the well-established figure showing a reduced life expectancy of about 20 years in those with psychosis. At the 20-year follow-up, we calculated the standardized mortality rates, and we can see for young males an increase in mortality rates by a ratio factor of 9. We also looked at changes in body mass index over 20 years. And this data shows that at presentation, the majority of the group were in the normal BMI category, but this pattern had reversed at 20 years. In response to these figures, we have developed a physical health intervention that is tailored for people with serious mental illness. And Peter Gallagher has just published a paper showing that participation in the program is associated with improved self-esteem and activity levels. The qualitative feedback captured other benefits of the intervention. So, what have we learned from the psychosis research program? The importance of a multidisciplinary team and support from management cannot be underestimated. We have benefited from some great advice from the public and patient participants. We need to invest in measuring outcomes, and it's important to have a diverse portfolio of funders. You can do a lot with small sums of money, and the simplest of projects are often the most sophisticated. I want to finish by acknowledging the individuals and their families who have so patiently and altruistically participated in all the research programs. We're also indebted to the St. John of God Order. The community mental health services have always been most helpful and encouraging. I'd like to acknowledge the hard work and dedication of all the Avila House team, especially Felicity Fanning, who holds the whole programme together. And lastly but not least, I'd like to thank the backroom team of the Research Department, the Research Foundation, the Ethics Committee and the Data Protections Officers. Thank you very much for your attention.